Hey, this is Jeff, and today we're going to find out what is and isn't true about the confusing and often conflicting things you hear about sneaking and detection in New Vegas, including the real reason ghost people and dead money seem to have an almost supernatural ability to detect you. And it's not what anything I've ever read said it was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I want to show you the testing setup I used. Mainly so you know how I arrived at my findings, but also to maybe get a few sympathy likes because I spent a dumb amount of time and effort on this. What I have here is a test course similar to the one I made for my Run Speed Demystified videos a while back. But in this case, there's a script that holds the player stationary, spawns an enemy at the far end, and moves it toward you at a fixed rate. As soon as the enemy detects you, the script records the distance and despawns the enemy, which is kinda creepy the first few times you see it. I used a ghost person from the Dead Money DLC for the baseline because they're what sent me down this rabbit hole in the first place, but I eventually ran trials with other creatures and NPCs to see if the type of enemy matters or just their perception stat, and more on that later. However, even with a test course that tightly controls line of sight, the exact distance when they spot you varies based on random chance. The game uses a complicated formula to determine detection probability and then constantly rolls virtual dice in the background anytime enemies are nearby. So every measurement I recorded is actually the average of 5 runs down the course. So far so good, but the problem is the number of trials you need to run increases geometrically with the number of factors you want to test. 2 important factors are the player's sneak skill and the enemy's perception stat, and fortunately you can modify both with a script, so that's what it does. It starts with the player's sneak at 25 and the enemy's perception at 0 and does 5 runs. Then it bumps up the player's sneak a bit, does 5 more runs, and so on until the player's sneak is 100. Because these tests run in real time, it wasn't feasible to test all values of sneak from 1 to 100, so it bumps it up by 15 for each trial, 25, 40, 55, and so on. After the test with the player skill at 100 is complete, it sets it back to 25, increases the enemy's perception by 1, and repeats the whole cycle until the enemy's perception reaches 10. That's a total of 330 runs, which can take anywhere from around 30 minutes to more than an hour depending on the other factors being tested. But because it's all automated, that part's much more time consuming for the computer than it is for me. I just kick it off and go do something else, and at the end it pops up a series of message boxes with the data, which I just need to copy into a spreadsheet. And by the way, the raw data you see here is in game units, but I translated them to feet for the graphs and tables you'll see later. My apologies to viewers who use the metric system. Unfortunately, one set of 330 runs only tests the interaction of player sneak and enemy perception for one scenario. By scenario, I mean combinations of other factors like whether the player is standing still, walking, or running, whether the Pip-Boy light is on or off, what kind of armor you're wearing, whether or not you have certain perks that affect sneaking like silent running and broad daylight, and environmental factors like how well lit the area is. There are 24 permutations of Pip-Boy light, movement, and those 2 perks alone. Some of them can be eliminated because, for example, the broad daylight perk only affects sneaking if your Pip-Boy light is on, so I didn't need to test any combinations with that perk when the light was off. But once you include environment lighting changes, the number of permutations becomes essentially infinite. I narrowed it down to 4 basic environments, an indoor course, and 3 outdoor courses. One that mimics the exterior lighting scheme of the Mojave Wasteland, one that mimics the Dead Money Villa, and one custom. The indoor course is pitch black with switches on the back wall here that turn on lights of various brightness. I started with the room lights off, ran all the valid combinations of Pip-Boy light, movement, and perks, then turned up the lights a bit and did it again until I had data for rooms from very dark to very bright. On the outdoor courses, I just had to run the tests during the day and at night, and then do the tests with different enemies, different armor, yada yada yada. In the end, I wound up with a spreadsheet containing the results of almost 6,000 permutations, each of which was the average of 5 runs, so that's around 30,000 individual creatures taking a slide down the course, which took well over 100 hours. And that's not counting all the times I had to rerun a test because I had a bug in the script, or I forgot some part of the setup, like turning on my Pip-Boy light before I kicked off a scenario, or whatever. Now, like I said, I wasn't sitting around watching it the whole time. My point is just that this is quite probably the most extensive set of empirical data around sneaking and detection that exists for New Vegas. So what does that data tell us? First off, some things you'd expect to be true from sources like loading screens and the Fallout Wiki, or just common intuition, and are true, at least for the most part. Sight and sound both play a role in detection, and your sneak skill makes a big difference to both. In the dark, or if an enemy doesn't have line of sight, it's all about sound. Three things determine how much noise you make: your sneak skill, movement, and your equipped armor. Contrary to what some sources say, and similar to run speed, the weight of what you're carrying in your inventory doesn't matter, only the armor you actually have equipped. However, I've seen conflicting information about sneaking in armor. Some claim only the armor class matters, light, medium, or heavy, while others claim it's the weight of your equipped armor. And testing shows they're both right, or both wrong if you're a glass half empty kind of person. Within a given armor class, heavier armor is noisier, but the armor class also makes a difference. For example, 45-pound T45D power armor in the heavy class is a lot noisier than 45-pound enclave power armor, which for some reason is in the medium class, even though it has the same weight. For the other two factors, the effect of sneak skill is pretty self-explanatory, and regarding movement, walking makes a little bit of noise and running makes a lot, as you'd expect. Something I didn't know until I started doing line of sight tests, and I've never seen explained anywhere else, is some obstacles that block line of sight also seem to muffle sound. When I spawned in enemies facing away from the player running, no perks, they detected me at the same distance they did facing toward me when I was running in pitch darkness, which is exactly what you'd expect because in both scenarios they were detecting me purely by sound. When I spawned in enemies facing me but separated by a wall, they detected me at the same distance they did if it was pitch black and I was standing still, which means not only could they not see me, but they couldn't hear me running either. And finally, the silent running perk works exactly as advertised. In every scenario, if you have the perk, enemies detect you at the same distance walking or running as if you were standing still. Now, if the enemy does have line of sight, then the brighter the light, the less important sound is. In the middle of the Mojave at noon, it basically doesn't matter how much noise you make if you're in the enemy's line of sight because they're going to see you before they hear you. On a similar note, the darker it is, the more difference your Pip-Boy light makes. Its fall-off value is set so you can't see very far if you use it in a dark area, but it's still really bright, so enemies can spot you much farther away than you can see them if it's on. But in a brightly lit area where enemies could spot you from even farther away, the Pip-Boy penalty doesn't make it much worse, if at all. So for example, in light conditions from pitch black to about this bright, if you have high sneak skill, you're not moving, and your Pip-Boy light is off, most enemies won't detect you unless they actually bump into you. But if you turn it on, they'll see you from 50 feet away or more. For comparison, this level of room light with Pip-Boy off is roughly equivalent for detection purposes to a pitch black room with it on. And if you turn it on in this level of light, they'll spot you from even farther away. So as you can see, if you're trying to sneak around enemies in the dark, or even medium lighting, don't turn on your Pip-Boy unless it's absolutely necessary. But by the time it gets this bright, the detection range with environmental light alone is much farther than from the Pip-Boy light, so turning your Pip-Boy on wouldn't make it much worse, although obviously in a room this bright you wouldn't need it. Outdoors, the same general principles apply with a few wrinkles. And here's where we start getting into areas where things you might have read are incomplete or in some cases flat out wrong. I already mentioned that your inventory weight doesn't matter despite some sources saying it does, but there's more. The construction kit documentation says the game applies a multiplier to ambient light in exterior locations, but the data shows that enemies detect you at least twice as far away in an exterior as an interior, even if the ambient light is set to 0 and there are no other light sources, so they're detecting you purely by noise. It seems like the documentation is wrong, and the game applies the multiplier to the overall detection chance outdoors, not just to the ambient light component. Next, some sources have claimed that time of day affects detection chances outdoors. That's why halfway through my playthrough of the Koito Ergo Sum DLC crossover, I started trying to do the most dangerous missions at night. Unfortunately, that's not true. Most exteriors are simply brighter during the day than at night, which is the only reason there's a difference. And in Dead Money, the exterior lighting parameters never change. They're exactly the same 24 hours a day. The results from the test course that mimics the villa confirmed what the environment configuration implied. The detection numbers were identical around the clock. which is why my only go out at night strategy didn't work. And to put the final nail in the coffin of that theory, I inverted the day-night cycle in my custom exterior course so it was dark at noon and bright at midnight, and sure enough, sneaking was easier at noon and harder at midnight. Finally, as I also discovered in the Coito Ergo Sum DLC crossover walkthrough, the broad daylight perk is basically useless. It supposedly adds a sneak buff to counteract the Pip-Boy Light's sneak penalty so that, and I quote, Pip-Boy 3000's light does not affect sneak. Now, it does add 15 points to your sneak skill when you're sneaking with the Pip-Boy light on, but that's a far cry from how silent running actually removes the movement penalty from the detection calculation altogether. And if your sneak skill is already 100, which mine was, it does absolutely nothing, because sneak is capped at 100 for detection purposes. But A, the perk is locked to level 36 or higher, and if your sneak skill isn't already pretty good by that point, you're just not interested in sneaking. And B, 15 points doesn't even come close to offsetting the Pip-Boy light penalty in any situation, with one counterintuitive and fairly unlikely exception. If your sneak skill isn't very good, and you're in a very brightly lit area where the environmental lighting outweighs your Pip-Boy light in the detection calculation, like high noon in the middle of the Mojave, then turning it on will actually make you harder to detect. Maybe that's why they call the perk broad daylight, because that's the only time it's useful. But I didn't spend 3 months on this to tell you a bunch of stuff you already knew and bust a few myths. The thing that makes it all worth it is, I finally discovered what's up with those freaking ghost people. First, a few things it isn't. A lot of sources blame their superhuman detection ability on having a perception stat of 0, claiming that this actually makes their perception stat essentially infinite. And that's not true. Most of them do have perception 0, and the data indicates that perception 0 is slightly better than perception 1. That could just be a statistical anomaly. But considering the size of the data set, maybe not. But either way, perception 0 is nowhere near as good as perception 10 or even perception 2, and definitely not infinite. If you use the Ghost People Perception Fix mod, which changes their perception to 1, at best it might let you get a couple feet closer before you're spotted, but every little bit helps, so I'm not going to say the mod is useless. People who have criticized the mod say the real problem is that most buildings in the villa aren't true interiors, but are actually part of the exterior world space, which is true, and as we already saw, enemies get a significant bonus to detection in exteriors compared to interiors. But that's not the whole story either, because even in true interiors, ghost people spot you way easier than other enemies do. Eventually, I started thinking the game might be doing something behind the scenes that wasn't visible in the construction kit creature stats menu. For example, there's a hidden attribute called Night Eye that supposedly gives creatures a bonus to their detection chance if they have it. If the game was setting that flag on ghost people at runtime, it might account for their behavior. So I made a copy of a ghost person base object which has identical stats, but which the game wouldn't recognize as a ghost person. But when I tested my copy, its detection ability was identical to a real ghost person. So I thought maybe the game was recognizing ghost people by something other than their base object, like their faction membership or code that fired when they switch AI packages. Removed all factions and all AI packages from my copy, nada. Same results. So I decided to quantify exactly how much better ghost people are at detection than other creatures, hoping that would give me a clue. And oh yes, it did. I always assumed that Deathclaws were better at detecting you than, say, Radroaches because their perception stat is higher. That's what all the documentation says, and I had no reason to disbelieve it until now. But when I ran a variety of creatures through my test course, it was immediately obvious that's not the main difference. As you can see from the chart, a Deathclaw with perception 1 is still way better at detecting you than a Radroach with perception 10. And the ghost people problem isn't just everyone's imagination because they're in a league of their own. One thing I had noticed when looking through the ghost people's stats is that a lot of them have their default scale factor set to a number greater than 1. Maybe if the game was treating them as if they were taller than they really are, their field of view was better or something. Which seemed like it might explain the difference in creatures. Radroaches are extremely short, so their cone of vision could be half underground and useless, whereas Deathclaws are really tall and presumably have a better view. So I set the default scale of my fake ghost person to 1, and there was no difference, which made me think it might be an attribute in their actual 3D model. Those models mainly contain geometry information that describes the shape of an object or creature, along with how to map 2D textures onto that surface, but they also have a lot of extra data, things like weight, center of gravity, and collision detection, or what a lot of people call the hitbox. Maybe the shape and/or length of their vision cone was hidden in there too. So I cloned a radroach object and assigned it the 3D model for a ghost person. But guess what? Its detection numbers came out identical to a radroach. So if it wasn't the game doing something sneaky at runtime, and it didn't have anything to do with the 3D model, it had to be one of the attributes in the construction kit creature menu. And since I already tried changing every setting that made sense, it was either give up or start trying attributes that didn't make sense. Well, skipping over a few more dead ends, the construction kit documentation says the level attribute is only used to determine how many XP a creature is worth when you kill it. Here's the breakdown, which begs a couple questions. If that's all it's used for, why make it a lookup? Why not just make XP value be a primary creature attribute and be done with it? And if the XP reward caps at level 10, what's the point of anything over level 10, since they're worth 50 XP whether they're level 10, 20, or 30? Well, as it turns out, there aren't very many. For reference, the highest level setting for creatures in the base game is 30, and only 3 are that high: Marcus, Mother Deathclaws, and the legendary Deathclaw. There are 4 more at 25, Deathclaw alpha males, the legendary Cazador, and legendary Fire Gecko, and some of the Securitrons that spawn at the Battle for Hoover Dam. At level 20, you only have generic Deathclaws, Mark 6 turrets, and Jacobstown super mutants, and Tabitha. Between 11 and 19, you have most of the game's tougher generic enemies, but more than 3/4 of the enemies in the game are marked as level 10 or below. Dead Money throws that distribution out the window. If you're below level 10 when you play it, it'll spawn ghost people marked as level 15, and it only gets worse from there. The ones that spawned for Courier Jeff were marked as level 35, higher than any enemy in the base game, but they can go all the way up to 50. That level 35 variant is what I used for the sneak tests, and so was the fake ghost person copy I made. And guess what? When I set the level of the ghost person copy to 1, same as a radroach, its detection numbers dropped to exactly the same as a radroach. Set it to 3, same as a basic feral ghoul, its detection ability was identical to a feral ghoul. Set it to 20, same as a Deathclaw, it was the same as a Deathclaw. Now bear in mind, even if you start Dead Money below level 10, most ghost people will be marked as level 15, which means they'll already be more likely to spot you than 90% of the enemies in the base game. The ones I tested with, at level 35, are better at detecting you than literally any creature in the Mojave, even the unique mega bosses. And at level 50, they can detect you well beyond the game's theoretical maximum detection range of 5,000 units or 235 feet. I expanded my outdoor test course to 300 feet, and they were still detecting me the instant they spawned. So, yeah. And that, my friends, is why ghost people are such a nightmare to sneak around. If somebody wanted to make a truly effective ghost people perception fix mod, they could simply reduce the level setting of the ghost people variants to something in line with comparably dangerous creatures from the Mojave. Say 5 for the weakest ones, up to 20 or 25 for the strongest. It wouldn't have any effect on their combat lethality or other characteristics, but it would make stealth a viable option in Dead Money. Well, that's about it. My apologies for the long hiatus in publishing any videos, but I only have one PC that still runs New Vegas, and I obviously couldn't use it for anything else while hundreds of hours of detection tests were running. But in the end, I think solving a 10-year-old mystery that to the best of my knowledge had never been correctly solved before now was worth it. Hit the like button if you agree, share this if you know other Fallout players who are still wondering, and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thing and haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.